Welcome back to the Smart City Symposium. I'm glad to see same faces as this morning and new faces coming in for this afternoon session. So for those of you who weren't here this morning, we were smartened up a little bit more in how to building trust, to civic engagement, to introducing meaningful inefficiencies in the process, hopefully to make it more transparent and more participatory in building smarter and smarter cities. And the case studies that we heard this morning so far were mostly from what we call the Western Hemisphere, to say it just very broadly and bluntly as a geographer, I'm allowed to do so. Now we are turning our gazes actually to perhaps a different part of the world. You see it here written here. And so with Dr. Robert Cowley, his guidance, his expertise will probably also add another critical perspective and looking into the rising sun, I guess, in the east. So Dr. Robert Cowley is currently a lecturer and a postdoctoral research scholar, and I hope you correct me if I'm wrong, in the geography department, yet another geographer, and from King's College in London. And with his training and background and expertise honed in Westminster in London at the Westminster University, he brings in yet another very diverse background and to add another facet of the discussions that we had already this morning. His expertise, aside from being smart and inducing smartness in cities, is especially looking at the eco part of the city, of city initiatives, and he has done so in various places of the world, for example, in the US and also in Korea. So his research focuses on governance and urban sustainability, public and public spaces, sustainability processes. And aside from teaching geography at King's College, he's also been a coordinator from very large and multi-year projects, several ones, including the Leverhulme Trust-funded International Research Consortium, Tomorrow's City Today, an international comparison of eco-city frameworks, and currently he's coordinating the Smart Eco-Cities project, a comparative study of Europe and China. And China, I guess, is the word. And with that, I present to you Dr. Cowley. Please take it from here.
Thank you very much for the introduction, which I'll have to take a copy of later. It's very useful. So running through, I think, all the research that I've done in my PhD and other projects I've worked on since then, I guess, is a kind of overall interest in how we should actually conceptualize and make sense of these, what you might call big ideas. The eco-city, the smart city, the creative city. I mean, they're very peculiar phenomena which people have tried to theorize in different ways. I'm not going to offer a completely fresh set of theorizations about them, but they seem to bubble up in the world and spread rapidly, and yet they're very vague and nebulous. And somehow they're translated into more localized ideas and particular practices on the ground, which are just endlessly varied. So, yeah. That's better, yeah. So, I mean, at some point you then start thinking, well, how do we actually make sense of something like the smart city? You know, do we think of it, at what level do we try and analyze it or trace it or conceptualize it? How does it all fit together? I mean, maybe we don't need to. But I'm just going to perhaps tap into those debates a little today by looking through the lens of a particular city in China, which I was looking into last year. That's part of our 3-year Smarts Eco-City research. I'd call it a research consortium, really, rather than a project, with 12 colleagues from different universities around the world, or rather in Europe and China. Okay, so the focus is on the city of Wuhan. Now, I feel like I don't know you well enough. Everybody's in a row, like in a lecture. So, who's been to China? And who's been to the city of Wuhan? Okay, are you an expert in the city of Wuhan? Good, okay. My fear was that there would be some people around who knew a lot more than me about this particular city. I would never position myself as an expert in China, or in fact, as somebody who's spent an enormous amount of time in the city of Wuhan. I've been there, I've done a little bit of research there, and I've read about it. But nevertheless, hopefully that's an interesting little case study in itself, just of a sort of slightly different take on the smart city. All right. Alberto Vanolo, who wrote an interesting article last year about the way that the smart city and related ideas appear in various kind of general public cultural products like films and books and the sort of way that we imagine the smart city. And he came out with quite a sort of negative set of conclusions that we tend to imagine it in quite a sort of dystopian way. And I think that's quite different from the eco-city, where there's lots of, you could say, grassroots enthusiasm for making cities sustainable and ecologically friendly. But the smart city doesn't seem to have caught on in the public imagination to that same sort of extent. And he talked about, he did a little review of the smart cities literature in this paper. And he suggested, in very broad brush terms, that there are three strands to this literature, three tendencies. One of which is what he called the celebratory strand. And that's what you might find typically in things like engineering journals or electronics engineering. And that answers the very important question, which is perfectly valid in itself, and it's far more technical than I could ever achieve, about how we could actually go about using all this new digital technology and big data and the Internet of Things to make our cities better places. How can we make the city more efficient? We heard earlier that efficiency isn't necessarily what we always want, but, you know, how do we make our cities work better, less polluting, clearer? So this is all fine. There's lots of potential there. The second strand is the more social sciencey one, which was taken up largely by the urban geographers especially, which is basically always critical. This was a wonderful topic to grab. Great, we can write some critical papers. We can sort of set up some sort of clever theoretical framework and lay into these sort of big ideas just for fun. And of course that's always a problem with critical work, that you don't really offer anything constructive in its place. And the third strand is more emergent, and it tries to imagine what an alternative vision of the smart city could be, a more progressive smart city for the people, or a smart city using another name, digital technology. So it's the second strand there, this sort of critical one, that sort of interested me at first, in the sense that this is going back, say, 10 years, 8 years, when the first smart city articles started appearing in academic journals. You know, you had this idea which was produced by people like IBM, the big corporates, and people who actually knew anything about cities. Thought, well, what are you talking about? This is a terrible sort of vision of a city. It's highly reductive. It's very partial. This seems to be all about top-down planning. It seems highly technocratic. It's a sort of imposition from above. And, you know, we've learned quite a lot of things about the way that cities work in the last 50 years. Why are we having to sort of deal with this? This is ridiculous. And this sort of stream of articles has continued to come out sort of in this very negative vein. And I think one of the sort of images which was referred to earlier was this sort of the Rio de Janeiro control room, which regularly pops up in papers and on websites, both in the more celebratory literature and in the critical literature. It seems to be a sort of emblem of the smart city, which I think has become a cliche. And I think actually the whole idea of the smart city as dystopian has itself become a kind of cliche. Yes, those original corporate visions were very negative. But when we started looking into what's actually happening on the ground as these corporate images have been sort of translated into local policies, which at least talk the language of citizenship all the time, what we found really was just sort of endless variety. I mean, even in one country, in the UK, it's not a very good graphic. And really, why did I need to show you a picture of the UK? But actually, the cities listed there are the ones which currently have substantial programs of activities or policies which are sort of go under a kind of smart city rubric. It's something like a third of Britain's cities and towns over 100,000 in population, or just under half if you count London as one city. And this was based on a kind of survey that we did a couple of years ago. So as a researcher, you're thinking, wow, this is really big. This is all over the place. This is an amazing sort of substantial set of, a substantial transformation of this big idea into things on the ground. I mean, no, it depends how you count it. Yeah, it's very difficult to say yes or no in these cases, but actually, surprisingly not. Although the funny thing is that even as you're doing this research, everything changes all the time. You know, websites disappear, documents appear, names change, so it's very hard to pin down. But actually, on the ground, when you look into it a little bit more further, what you end up finding is that in a lot of places, all you have is a few very small pilot activities, or things haven't actually really got off the drawing board, or already existing activities are sort of rolled into the smart city label. Beyond that, I think activity on the ground is just characterized by an incredible amount of variety. So yes, we have the odd kind of control room, and yes, we have things associated with mobilities, which we referred to earlier as well, the smart parking schemes and all that. And there are also some digital infrastructural innovations, new broadband networks, blah, 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 blah. But also all sorts of other stuff that doesn't so easily fit into the idea of a smart city that we might have. Just, for example, an attempt to bring in a new digital screen into a city centre, or activities called hackathons, when people will get together and try and use data for new events, or entrepreneurial speed dating, which has nothing to do with romance, but where it's just organised by the Mayor of London, trying to get different tech entrepreneurs together to talk about it. Other community events. In Bristol, which we heard about just before lunch, there's sort of these citizen centre networks being set up, the attempt to create a digital commons for people. Actually, interestingly, despite this variety, there's very little on the ground which is to do with getting the public involved in decision-making through traditional channels. There's a lot about getting citizens involved in co-producing the city through what they do, creating things. But this doesn't seem to sort of tap into traditional representative institutions of government. It seems to bypass it in lots of ways. And this is also running in parallel, if you like, to standard planning practices. This is very projectified, experimental projects, things like that. Anyway, I think this is just one country, but it poses quite an analytical challenge for me in that we've got this smart label, which is very vague and inconsistent, like a lot of these big ideas are. What Simin Davoudi calls them spatial imaginaries. So they're created from a mixture of floating ideas and concepts and practices dynamically together. And we can all sort of form a vague image in our mind of what a smart city actually is or looks like somehow, or there's something like an image we have which isn't quite a clear image. But they're not only vague, they also shape urban development in particular ways rather than others. And yet the local outcomes on the ground are shaped by countless factors and are actually characterized by a kind of wild heterogeneity, both in terms of the policy narratives that surround them and enable them, both in terms of the relationship to mainstream policy making differs wildly from place to place, even in one country, certainly between countries. The types of actors involved, the nature of the governance arrangements around them, and what people are actually doing. It's almost as if, taken as a whole, there's no common thread. And yet the common thread still seems to be this sort of big idea that somehow encapsulates everything. So how do we want to approach this phenomenon? I mean, I think for me, if we're trying to actually learn lessons from what's worked and what's happened, of course we can't just sort of point to the old trap of taking best practice from one place and applying it to another, as Gesa was talking about earlier. And if we want to conduct comparative analysis, what sort of frameworks can we have for thinking about this sort of this phenomenon? I'll share our broad one at the end, but I haven't got a full answer. And to sort of approach this variety of the smart city, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a case study from the other side of the world, where plainly we can't just think about it in the same way that we'd think about what might be happening in Zurich or Hamburg or London. This is the Chinese city of Wuhan, which I've chosen as an ordinary city in the sense that it's not one of the big cities on the East Coast, which is continually in the international limelight and might be used as a sort of showcase for China's activities. It's more reflective of everyday urban China. And I'm just going to look at it very briefly from 3 different perspectives through which we might think about the smart city. And then I'm going to suggest some things that tells us about the Chinese smart city, specifically what's distinctive about it. And then just reflect on what this tells us about smart city development elsewhere and how we should approach it in our research and practice, maybe. So this is the part of the lecture where I talk about the city that you've never been to and is potentially quite boring unless you like sort of holiday photos and stuff. But I'm telling you about Wuhan in order to explain why I'm interested in Wuhan. And I'll use the red device to point out where Wuhan is to save you the trouble of finding it. Chinese cities are divided informally, actually, into 4 or sometimes 5 tiers. So the tier 1 cities are all basically the rich cities on the East Coast. The Beijings, the Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen down here. Wuhan counts as a tier 2 city. At the same time, it's the most populous city in central China. It's got about 10 million inhabitants. And you can see that it's on that's actually the Yangtze River here. It's the most important shipping center in the central section of that river, and has for a long time been a really important sort of point where sort of trade going from west to east and north to south crosses. So it's been a very important Chinese city for trade, commerce, and industry for a long time. And in fact, as recently as 1981, it was the 4th largest center of industry in China. Since the 80s, of course, all the reforms have been focused on the coastal regions, so those cities have developed further and grown much richer. Wuhan has remained dependent on heavy industry, and that's meant that its relative wealth, if not its absolute wealth, has actually decreased over time. So its gross national income, what's the expression? Per capita income. Is actually now not a lot higher than the average for China as a whole. When I was there, the second morning, I went for a little walk down the river, which was just by my hotel, the Yangtze River, and I took this evocative photograph of the bridge, stepping off into the mist and the men walking. It looks like a Japanese painting or something. I was very naive. I didn't realize that this romantic mist was actually pollution. This is on Sunday morning. And by the way, I think that's also a real cliche to show sort of Chinese cities and pollution as well, so apologies for that, for any Chinese people in the audience. But yeah, I was just from a conversation at lunchtime earlier, I was hearing that we were talking a little bit about air pollution. And I don't know if any of you have seen the famous documentary that came out a couple of years ago by somebody whose name I can't remember at all, which was all about air pollution in Beijing. How nobody knew about it in the old days because the weather forecasters used to talk about, there's going to be a lot of mist tomorrow. A lot of fog. I can see what they mean. Anyhow, yeah, so I'm just showing that to show that Wuhan still is quite dependent on heavy industries, and you notice that when you go there. At the same time, it's not only dependent on heavy industries, it's got a lot of potential to become a big player in the knowledge industries. It's one of the biggest higher education centers in China, the most important one after Beijing and Shanghai. And there's been lots of attempts to set up high-tech investment parks, which they claim relative success in attracting sort of new types of industries from China and abroad. So they're trying to move away from heavy industry. In the meantime, national development policies are increasingly focused on these tier 2 cities. So the idea is that, yes, Shanghai is full and Beijing is full. What we need to do is now sort of divert development into these sort of more inland tier 2 cities. There's national development policies like the rise of the central China go west. So Wuhan's expected to develop fast economically over the coming years and will probably have an upgrade to its formal status as well. So keep your eye on Wuhan. Anyway, Wuhan's interesting because it's earmarked then as having significant economic potential in the future. And its success is intended to be a blueprint for the development of other tier 2 cities. So it's a really interesting case to study, to sort of think about current ways in which the urban future in China is being imagined and planned. So on the one hand, it's an ordinary city, if you like, more typical of the kind of city where most people actually live rather than the big flashy showcase places. But on the other, it's a useful indicator of what the future might hold for Chinese cities. And in terms of the smart city specifically, it's a relative pioneer in the area, ahead of a lot of other things that are going on in China. In 2010, the local Municipal Science and Technology Bureau announced, over a million euros spend on smart city activities. I'm not going to work through those one by one in tremendous detail because it's after lunch and I don't know a lot about many of them. But just to think about the variety of stuff going on. Part of this is industrial. It's about pharmaceuticals, agricultural production, meat production. We've also got a series of more social sort of things happening. Parents, schools, smart campus communications. You might know that type of system where the parents get sent a message to their smartphone to let them know that their child has arrived at school. And the parents can communicate very easily with the teachers in the classroom, that sort of stuff. A scheme so that people can read books through their televisions, which seems peculiar to me. QR codes on historic buildings. So if you go to a historic building, you want to find out more. The QR codes are much more popular in China than they are in Europe. You just go beep and you get all the information about the building down your phone. Telemedicine, smart health, and then a load of other stuff which is all to do with digital infrastructure and public services. Sewage management, smart parking, GIS information in the cloud. Citywide networks of surveillance and traffic cameras, all connected to the central police station, public Wi-Fi, hotspots, etc., etc., etc. So, there's a substantial program of smart city activities taking place there. And I want to think about how we might, first of all, explaining those in three ways, if you like. The first one is, I guess, a vertical perspective. The role of policy making from above. I mentioned the 2010 competition earlier. That was itself enabled by a sort of central government scheme organized by the Ministry of Science and Technology, which named Wuhan as a pilot city in a scheme. The current National Urbanization Plan, which runs from 2014 to 20, whose aim is, by the way, to convert the population into urban residents in an orderly manner. So this is a really important guiding principle of Chinese urban policy, that yes, we want to grow the cities, and yes, we want to grow the economy, but overarching all of that is that it needs to be done in an orderly manner. We must maintain social order. Everything's subsumed within that. But within the current urbanization plan, there are directions to drive forward the building of smart cities. And since 2012, there's been a raft of quite specific national policies, which you might not find in a lot of countries. Again, I'm not going to work through each one in turn. But these involve a variety of bodies: the State Council, Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, funding plans to finance smart city development, etc., 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 cross-ministry strategic documents. So the smart city is really an important thing in the thinking of Beijing. I mean, one important thing among many, of course. But taken together, there's quite a clear direction, and there are clear pots of funding that cities can apply for. And so I guess thinking about it in that way would give us a kind of crude model of this sort. And I know these models are true, but I'm just sort of banging up three models to sort of think about this in three different ways. We can approach the smart city sort of from the top down as a good example of the way that the phenomenon of fast policy transfer in the current world. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea that's been developed by certain economic geographers. The idea that we get these new big ideas popping up, for example, in Philadelphia, and then before you know it, the same policy idea is being applied in Manchester and Hamburg and Singapore all of a sudden. But of course, when these ideas are transferred from one setting to the next, they're not precisely replicated. They usually go through a process of translation or hybridization into national or local policy. So we can think of the smart city as this nebulous idea floating around, but then it's selectively adopted and aligned with existing national agendas. So it takes on a particular flavor in a national context. That in turn is hybridized into local policy narratives, sort of used for particular ends and made to sort of match up with existing city trajectories, and then that results in specific activities on the ground. So we could do a sort of piece of analysis which, traces this in a sort of quite crude vertical way, but I think that would be interesting in itself to do in any particular case. The perspective number two has quite a different sense of agency. It's all related to something like urban entrepreneurialism. Again, a notion which has been quite, it's a very well-known notion, certainly in the geographical literature. I think probably many of you are familiar with it, so apologies. But if you're not, it's the idea that since particularly the late 1980s, cities, and this is based on the experience of cities in Northern Europe and North America in particular, have moved away from a traditional remit just to provide welfare and services for their residents. Instead, they've started looking much more towards the outside world, consciously aware of the need to compete on the global stage, and this involves all this kind of city branding and city imaging and promotion going on. And the other dimension to urban entrepreneurialism is the willingness to work in tandem with the private sector, often on projects which run in parallel to the sort of main strategic policy making they're doing. So this can all end up being quite fragmented, and there are all sorts of questions around accountability. But it's a different sort of way of doing local governance. Now, of course, there are quite a few problems with taking a concept like urban entrepreneurialism, which was developed in relation to certain Western cities, and just applying that straightforwardly to the Chinese city. We're not in a situation in China where cities are struggling to do something in the wake of industrialization. We can't talk about China being a post-industrial country in the way that Western cities were, because it didn't have much industry until relatively recently. Nor is it the case that we've got sort of, that we can interpret it critically as being sort of post-social democratic. That doesn't really mean anything in the Chinese context. And it's a different case again from other socialist countries which have had to sort of turn into a capitalist have to sort of adopt a capitalist system. So you wouldn't be able to say that Chinese cities are entrepreneurial in the same way that certain cities in Eastern Europe now are. But nor is it obviously about a rollback of the state. In fact, in China, perhaps the main aim is to in various ways, to keep on strengthening the state. In particular, other local flavors, as I mentioned, these activities are always constrained by the overarching need for social stability. And China can't go about business relying on horizontal networks of association with other cities in the same way that we see Western cities as sort of, would be associated with all these international networks of things like ICLE. And so, nevertheless, despite all this, there are certainly some clear symptoms of urban entrepreneurialism in Wuhan. If you walk around the city, you'll see this sort of this branding imagery. Wuhan, different every day, which on the surface is just a sort of, well, we have to come out with some kind of branding logo for the city to attract people to visit, whatever. This is as good as any. And yet, I think it's just interesting that it probably consciously taps into a discourse of flexibility, different every day, being able to manage rapid change. And also the fact that, it's in Chinese and English means that it clearly has an intended external audience. So I think a lot of, the more I thought about the case of Wuhan, the more things I found which disrupted an idea of it being an example of a smart city idea sort of emanating from Beijing, including the active role of a lot of foreign interests. Consulates keep opening in Wuhan, different trade offices from different countries. Quite interestingly, when Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, went to visit China recently, she went to Beijing and Wuhan. That were her two places. Very strong links with France and the UK. They're very proud of the growing number of residents. And the 2010 competition that I mentioned earlier was sort of groundbreaking in the Chinese context because it was just so open and global. The local authorities were inviting collaboration with companies abroad. And the whole thing is sort of being rolled out with the involvement of hundreds of local companies. So I don't think the vertical model really necessarily explains much. It does explain quite a lot. But what you've also got is this very horizontal agency of institutional networks. The local authorities in Wuhan working directly with other local authorities abroad. They've got very strong links with Manchester and I think with Bordeaux as well as with international private sector actors and local private sector actors. And somehow it's from all this that the activities have emerged, not necessarily just because they've been ordered to do it by Beijing. And yet, from a third perspective, perhaps the smart city, and thinking about the official activities I mentioned earlier, perhaps it doesn't really matter at all. Perhaps we're talking about something that's just really a sort of fleeting drop in the ocean that's going to go away, that it's part of a much broader digitalization of urban life. And I think there's a real risk as researchers that if we sit around reading about the smart city phenomenon from different official policy documents and reports, we start imagining that it's something much more important than it actually is. The kind of map that I showed you before of the UK might make you think, wow, depending on how you count, half of the cities in this one country are adopting smart city policies. This is the future of cities. Cool, and that's going on all over the world. Wow, the smart city is the topic to look at. And yet, the problem is, if you actually go to any of these cities who are the sort of poster child for the smart city, you get there and you don't really find much. There's no particular visible evidence of the smart city taking place. You think, well, where is it? What's happening? And if there is something related to the smart city going on, actually it seems to be more at the level of things which are not really part of official policies. It's to do with smartphone use in particular, or Uber. In Chinese cities, as a Western visitor, you're immediately struck, for example, by the widespread use of mobile payment systems. People using their smartphones to pay for goods and services, to transfer money to each other in a way that I don't think happens in Switzerland, from what I could tell from my brief conversation at lunchtime. Certainly doesn't happen in the UK. Alipay, WeChat, Baidu, they're massive. The presence of QR codes everywhere. The types of bike sharing schemes that you can see all over the place, famously, which have got, which are enabled by QR codes, and they're run on GPS technology. It's really invasive thing going on everywhere in the city. The internet itself, China's got quite strong internet coverage, and smartphones, I think. Approaching 7 in 10 Chinese adults uses a smartphone these days, rises to something like 94% of young people, and it's even higher than that in urban areas. So there's a real sense for me in which the smart city actually, from this perspective, is just a sort of something like, it remains important, but it's a reflection of something that's going on anyway. You could visualize it like that. Yes, it may catalyze a few things or reflect stuff, but as a policy label, actually it's going to vanish. And I'm very worried about investing too much of my research interest into the smart city. I bumped into somebody a few years ago who'd spent his whole PhD and first 2 postdoc jobs focusing on the creative city. And he was saying to me, I don't think I've got a future in academia because nobody promotes themselves as a creative city anymore. My research is stuck in the past. So I don't know. I think the smart city is going to pass away as a label. And yet, somehow it still remains important. We can't just dismiss this sort of globally circulating discursive idea, which is being, backed by corporations and policymakers and with lots of money, and clearly does have some sorts of tangible effects on space, can have better ones and worse ones. But maybe it's just a reflection of something else. So anyway, to come back to my question, what's perhaps distinctive about the Chinese smart city? What's the Chinese take on the smart city? I think a lot of the individual activities that are going on, let's say smart parking or attempts to improve the patient information service in hospitals, are not at all unique to Wuhan anyway. They're ideas which have been perhaps copied from somewhere else, or, essentially. So on that level, perhaps it's not very distinctive. And yet, running through all this, I think there's a very passive sense of the public. And this is taken from a paper that I published with a couple of others last year about the way that the public is imagined in smart city initiatives in Britain, largely as a very passive set of service users, people who consume services. There's no real attempt, it seems, in Wuhan or other places to use smart city technology to to democratize cities, or to get people really developed in thinking about what they could do and what they could do differently. I think it makes a lot of sense to read the Chinese smart city as being subsumed through these sort of top-down policy priorities. A policy context of supporting economic development, obviously, improving efficiency of public services, managing urban growth, supporting social stability. It's not about the democratization of cities, and it's probably more about strengthening the state, rather than what we might see in a Western city where, as discussed earlier, it could be a way of sort of doing more with less in the time of austerity. So there's a particular flavor to it in China, although it's not completely different. I think it's very interesting that in China, the smart city, as noted earlier, is advocated in national planning documents, which is very different to, for example, Britain, where most of the smart city policy making has been driven by people like the Department for Business, Industry and Innovation, and now by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So although it's intervening into these sort of areas of urban infrastructure, which you'd think would be the responsibility of the Ministry of Local Communities and Planning, or whatever it's called in a different country, actually it's sort of being seen primarily in Britain by central government as a way of driving exports. It's the export opportunity that's interested in Britain. Again, another example is in the Netherlands, where perhaps one of the problems with smart city development in Holland is that local city actors say, well, no, we need some more support from central government. There isn't any, It's all bottom up and networked, and we need some. So it's significant in China that the smart city does appear in national planning documents. And yet, at the same time, I don't want to sort of replicate this idea that people have of China being this sort of top-down bureaucracy. I think it's better characterized by the phrase which is often used, the fragmented authoritarianism, where we can see that in things like the eco-city or the smart city, you get plans set up by lots of different ministries which run in competition. So cities can kind of pick and choose between them, between all these, and sort of tell their own story. They've got quite a lot of agency to choose what they do. And what does this tell us about smart city development elsewhere in the world? I mean, how could we think about this case of Wuhan, and what does that maybe help us do elsewhere? Well, I think the most obvious outtake is that the smart city isn't something where we should expect a linearity of implication. We're not really in the traditional field of planning here, where in an idealized model, something is devised by the government and funding is found, and then it is implemented, in a sort of straightforward fashion. I think it still remains very important to trace the policy influences, because these do have shaping roles. But actually, our starting point has to be that it's just a very flexible concept which derives legitimacy from and channels multiple sources and agendas in different places. And so in the Smart Eco-City project, we've been trying to develop a framework for thinking about smart cities, or in some kind of way which will allow us to at least draw parallels between different examples of this sort of very messy reality. And I'm not going to go much further than just sort of emphasize the fact that we think it's important at the same time to think of the smart city as a sort of loose discourse, which is then translated into national and local discourses and stories, as well as looking at precisely which institutions are involved and what effects that has, and looking at the materiality, the spatial effects, the material effects on the ground in particular places. And just focusing on any one of those seems quite problematic if we want to grasp the phenomenon. The early critical literature was just going in at the level of discourse. And I think we could equally go in through a very policy-centric institutional lens and miss a lot about the materiality on the ground. And strangely enough, it turned out that these three ways of looking at it mapped on quite closely to a paper looking at smart cities assemblage that I wrote last year, but didn't have this connection in mind, and to something that Mike Hodson wrote about sustainability generally, where he thinks of it as being reconfigured in different places on the ground through a mixture of discursive influences, local stories that are told, and particular governance arrangements. But also we have to think about the specific innovations that take place. And I think most importantly, if we're trying to approach the smart city for the purposes of understanding, learning lessons, or comparing it from one place to another, I think that we should actually think of it as a locally inflected symptom of a broader set of changes to urban space and governance. And we should keep in mind that they should be the final target of our analysis or critique, and perhaps not the smart city itself, because that's going to vanish into the air, I predict, within just a few years as a label. Nobody will understand what all those articles we've been writing are actually about. Maybe an exaggeration. So it's just some key sources from our project that I've drawn on, and that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So we are just at the brink of an extinction of a species, but before that, we have wonderful time, lots of time to engage in a discussion. I think right here, Gesa.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you for the lecture and the interesting case of Wuhan. I have a question. Do you think that the citizens of China, of Wuhan, in your case, will be more engaged, more involved in the future? Or do you think that they will remain in a way that passive, like you described that, concerning the dealing with data?
Well, I can't predict the long-term future, but again, it depends. if you're thinking about things like the bike sharing schemes, which is sort of the most visible aspect of the smart city that's going on, even though it's not called the smart city, of course, this is a huge private sector thing. And you can look at the city, and in the same row of bikes, you can see the old style public hire bikes, which were pretty much like the first wave of ones we had in Europe. So there's no particular use of digital technology. But then the new ones are all using technology. So in a sense, that's being driven by the private sector commercially. Now, in terms of more democratic things, I'm not sure about that. That would require a much more radical change in society. I guess the whole concept of planning in China has a totally different status. As far as I can see, planners are much more highly regarded than planners are in the West, much more revered as being experts in their fields, and even though there's relatively little input from the public. So I can't see the Chinese smart city in itself developing into a tool for citizen engagement in a political sense or just in terms of co-production. No. However, I think it's very closely aligned with a lot of other things that are happening in society which maybe do move in that direction, even if it's through the private sector.
Okay. And why is there such a strong bridge, you said, to Manchester and Bordeaux? That's a bit strange. Is there a reason, a special reason?
Yeah, there is actually. And the reason why I wanted to look into Wuhan in the first place is that Manchester is our UK case study, and I discovered that Manchester and Wuhan have a sister city arrangement going back over about 20 years. Okay. So I was interested I originally wanted to do some research into the history of that relationship. But yeah, so they've signed, they recently signed a memorandum of understanding where Wuhan would borrow from Manchester's experience of what they've done in a part of the city which they call the corridor running from... Does anybody know Manchester at all? No? Yeah. Around Manchester University, that sort of corridor coming out of the centre is full of all sorts of experimental activities in the environmental and the digital field. So Wuhan sort of hoping to learn from that. So they get, in theory, expertise from the West, and Manchester hopes to get exports out of it.
Can I ask one brief last question? And why do you, your last sentence, you said that we have to see digitalization in a broader set of changes, of urban changes. Could you comment on that again?
Yeah. I think you can also read the smart city as not just complementing a kind of idealized model of representative governance in the West, but actually threatening it in all sorts of ways. The whole idea behind it is not about deliberation and institutions, as you were precisely saying earlier in your thoughts. It's almost the imagery behind it and the kind of the ontology of it is that the city itself will govern itself, and that big data and algorithms, truths will emerge, magically, and that almost that we don't need to have discussion and democratic debate anymore. So the fact that this is all going on in a very experimental vein seems indicative in itself. What are we actually experimenting with? What are these changes to governance that we generally theorize using some sort of variation on the label, the neoliberalization of the state and the rollback of the state? But what's actually going on here, where we're placing our faith in digital technology?
I think we have a question, the green box.
Yes, so thanks for that interesting talk. And you gave a bit of a meta perspective on various smart cities. So I was wondering whether you actually came across some kind of pattern of what kind of data is being shared. Like these smart cities are driven, primarily data driven. So could you imagine a kind of let's say, a protocol of data that, different qualities of data that we'd need to share in order to create some kind of generic smart city infrastructure or something like that?
No, I'm not the right person to ask about that. It's too technical a question. But it's interesting to think about whether we would, whether that's ever going to be achievable in terms of getting protocols completely unified. And even if we did it, wouldn't things have moved on immediately? I'm not sure. And I think a lot of smart city programs and activities and initiatives, they would never state such a concrete goal in the end. They always seem to sort of defer the final outcome. They talk about, well, what we need to do is set up platforms which might enable further innovations in the future. And it's sort of, there's never a clear statement about where it's going. It's always about possibilities and enabling future innovations. But I don't know if an overall set of data standards, for example, for the world, is possible or desirable. Not sure. I don't know if anybody else has a more technical understanding of these things in the audience who's got it.
Well, actually, the question was not necessarily technical. It was just about what qualities of data would you expect to exchange. Doesn't need to, not necessarily how you're going to code it, but, what qualities of information are being exchanged, and from what kind of data do you expect that innovation to emerge, basically. And whether there you saw any kind of meta level of qualities that you would, that you could identify.
It's not really a question that I've thought about, actually. So I could make up some words for a while, but that's a very interesting point, though. Thank you.
While the box is looking
Moving.
for a new home. Oh, we have a new home.
moving.
Excellent. Please.
Oh, okay. I think we should start throwing these around because that's what they're designed for. Right? So my question for you has to do with the specific context of China, and I was hoping you can say a little bit more. And specifically around decision making. And what's interesting is that when we talk about smart cities, we can't. It's difficult to say what's happening in Manchester has any similarities to what's happening in Wuhan, largely because the process of decision-making is different, the expectations of democratic participation are different. And so when we talk about the integration or the adoption of technology as infrastructure within these cities, it's happening in a different way, and often the intentionality of that implementation is different. So for instance, in the United States and Europe, we can talk about, we talk a lot about civic data and open data. We talk a lot about transparency and participation. Those are not the conversations happening in China. And in fact, what I know more about what's happening in Taiwan and in Taipei, for example, they're actually, they're doing some extraordinary things within this smart cities frame, but they're actually seeing themselves as they're operating in very explicit distinction to China. And that's true with every aspect of society in Taiwan, but in particular in the way that cities are developing, they're thinking the way that they're incorporating decision-making, all of that is, we do this because China does not. And so I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more specifically about how do you see some of these smart city trends in China being used for nefarious purposes, largely because there's not the social infrastructure to allow for the kind of democratic participation that we see elsewhere.
Yeah, the most superficial answer to that would be that obviously it's going to be a lot more explicitly tied into possibility for surveillance over the population. But another way of sort of turning that around is, your question around completely, is just to observe that in the UK, somebody I was speaking to the other day was talking about his experience of local councils and about how people complain that this sort of technology is being introduced in a non-democratic way. Well, yes, but actually often it boils down to whether we're going to have this new type of street light, which is a straightforward operational decision which somebody would make in the council, and it would never go in front of the local councillors anyway. So there's probably a lot more of this stuff which is just introduced by councils in the West as well, that we might imagine if we draw up a sort of binary between something like autocratic China and the democratic West. But the overall picture, I don't think, is particularly going to move towards participatory planning in a big way anytime soon. As I mentioned earlier, I think the technical experts remain highly respected in China, and in many ways you could see that they've been very successful in achieving their goals of having a harmonious urbanization process to date. There hasn't been too many widespread riots, or slums and things haven't emerged on the edges of the city as they have in other countries which are urbanized rapidly. And maybe an interesting way to think about it is through the idea of input legitimacy and output legitimacy, which is a big theme in a well-known book about China by somebody whose name I've also completely forgotten, but it came out quite recently. And he talked about how he compared the case of China post-1991 to that of Russia, where Gorbachev put most of his faith in processes of opening up, democratization and transparency. And everything opened up, but he hadn't thought about how industry and commerce was going to develop, the developmental side of it. It all went wrong. Whereas in China, they did exactly the opposite. They put all their efforts into developing the country so that people might not have any real democratic input into what's going on, but on the whole, we don't really mind that if the results are okay. So long as the country seems to its own population to be developing further, it seems to be a pattern generally around the world that we don't really ask too many questions about the sort of democratic legitimacy of stuff. Like, in a normal city, the mayor might be a bit of a dodgy character, but he gets things done, so nobody asks too many questions. Or we might completely distrust our governments. But if somehow the hospitals are being built and the schools are being built and the new train tracks are going in, then we sort of brush a lot of these questions under the carpet. So, yeah, China's all about actually having results on the table and the citizens being able to see that things are happening and the country's getting better. Democracy isn't something which, apart from protesters, is necessarily the key factor in the country maintaining stability and legitimacy in its population's eyes. Sorry, I went off on one.
So, is it the blue one or the green one to speak? Okay.
That's just fine.
So, very interesting meta topic. Would it be possible for us to pull up once again the list of the smart city initiatives that you have shown with the three boxes?
I'll just get my smartphone out so I can look up any details if you...
That's good. So maybe I'll talk in meanwhile. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Without going too much into detail on each and every one, let's wait for the bell. Okay. It seems like these smart city initiatives are, I think there's a verb missing now, something like managed or championed by kind of an unbundled telecom industry, basically, with some very few exceptions, like the food box distribution to households, I would say. And especially with this kind of emphasis on QR codes and emphasis on mobile payments and all this. And there's some very real world consequences especially in terms of business models that comes from this. Because famously, the telecom industry and its lobby, GSMA, based in London, is famously against infrastructure building, right? So they don't want to have a physical smart city elements, right? They want the smart city to be a virtual kind of a virtual phenomenon, right? So it's actually not the street lamps you were speaking of, basically, which is a very big EU example, the humble lamppost. Yeah. And the business model, I'm sure most people know this, but I can repeat for some that don't know, is a question of platformization, right? So if you have an infrastructure which is being built, the owner of the infrastructure is the public government, right, or the local government, and that is the platform on which businesses and users build their services and offer products, right? But if your platform is given by Verizon or AT&T or Orange or T-Mobile or I don't know who operates in China, but I'm sure it's going to be an unbundled telecom industry, right? Then they are the gatekeepers who disallow users or businesses to build services and products on that platform, right? So this looks like a telecom dream, basically, really. Yeah, and the question that I want to ask you, have you noticed, and I'm wondering whether this does not have any consequences in terms of kind of participation and user kind of engagement and citizen engagement, because if citizens can engage on a public, if they can capture data and do something on their cell phone by putting together several kind of building blocks of code and come up with an app that tells you, I don't know, when your favorite bus is going to come because you actually live on the 4th floor and you need to kind of time it with your elevator or whatever. So if you have users who actually kind of can use data from a platform, so it's this business model, which is this infrastructure platform that has infrastructure built in. Maybe that is more kind of conducive to democratic or kind of user participation or citizen participation, however you want to call this. And basically, in China, we have seen a development of a virtual smart city, basically more based on the telecom world, and not really this physical kind of physical elements of the smart city. I'm wondering.
Possibly. There are quite a few traditional infrastructure things going on there, electronic tolls on bridges and tunnels. However, very interesting point, if you go to other cities in China like Ningbo, they've got a smart city museum, and you have a look around. It's called a museum, but actually, obviously, it's things move fast in China. It's a sort of exhibition hall. You realize after a while it isn't really an exhibition hall, it's just a kind of promotional center for a particular telecoms company.
Voila. Yeah.
So yes, a lot of this comes through the telecoms industry, certainly internet providers. But there again, look at what your average Chinese person does with their smartphone in terms of buying things and the kind of apps. It's actually a lot more advanced than the average use here. So, yes, I suppose there's a very strong alignment between the smart city and telecoms in China, which is a really interesting point to pull out.
Yeah. And maybe like a low one with education or any other options.
Yeah. Thank you.
The blue box, Harald.
The blue one, I actually wanted to relate back to the question that the person up there asked, but he obviously disappeared while I was formulating the question. When we talk about the smartness or the efficiency-driven approach in the smart city, then of course everybody agrees we talk about information technology and communication technology essentially, and what it can do for us. And now, I think what he actually could have meant by his question was, how can we talk about this whole approach? He used the notion of data and stuff like that, right? But of course, this can be easily related to information theory, information technology in general. And I had the sense that at some point we need to talk about more than pure, let me say, syntactic information. or Shannon information. And that's what information technology is based on, essentially.
Syntactic.
Syntactic, as opposed to semantic or maybe even more involved ideas. And nobody talks about meaning except Eric talks about meaning. And those who talk about meaning, the first sentence they mention is, this is too difficult a problem to deal with in information technology. And all our Google search and all our search machines are not working with meaning-related searches. They are using search algorithms which essentially look for sequences of symbols, which I mean by purely syntactic. Now, it seemed to me that this move from a purely syntax-driven information technology to something much more sophisticated and subtle. This might be, he was talking about a meta perspective.
Yeah.
This might be something he had, he's not here anymore, so it's perfect for me because I can't say everything.
We can speculate about what he might have gone on to say.
I'm only speculating.
Yeah.
So does that ring any bell, or does it resonate in some sense with?
Well, I was very interested earlier to hear about the reality of the fact that we are all quite scared of algorithmic governance. It's the same logic as being an insurance company deciding what our credit rating is based on certain calculations that we don't understand and nobody will tell us about. I'm sure we've all read the scare stories in the newspapers about the problems around algorithmic governance.
Yeah.
And yet, what we saw was that when something was introduced, actually the public reacted negatively. So we're not quite as passive as we imagine that we are. And I think the bigger picture is one of these new ideas and way of doing things not being imposed upon us, but becoming accommodated and negotiated. Mm-hmm. That negotiation does seem to happen a lot of the time. So almost inevitably, it's going to have to move from beyond, as you described, a syntactic sense of things just being attached to each other, truths emerging from the data. Because the kind of the model of the insurance company premium or claim only applies in certain spheres. So I think it's going to happen anyway. To some extent. Yeah.
Robert, I have a question. I don't have a box, but I have a microphone. So think of your next question while I'm asking mine. You introduced your assemblage concept, and maybe you can go back to the list of boxes that you contrasted with other work. And as you were suggesting the notion that this is a sort of a hype concept, smart city, it's going to go away. So something is going to stay, and you mentioned perhaps the idea, the contrast between something instantiated in real-world infrastructure as opposed to some ephemeral cyber city kind of thing. And your assemblage actually has a different box than everybody else's, and it's the most salient one, and it's called spatiality. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you mean by that. Is it a space of spaces in terms of information flows and networks that cannot be touched, or do you really think, as opposed to the depth of distance, as we've heard many, many times in geography, there's actually something real, some pattern, some real world, spatial pattern that traces of such distance?
Yeah.
Please.
I could guess what discipline you work in from your question. One of the questions that we were trying to raise in this paper was, can we say anything interesting about the spatiality of the smart city, how smart city technologies, in the case of the UK, perhaps reconfigure space or spatial relations? What's going on there? And we don't have to think of that in just sort of physical terms. We can also think about sort of things like public spheres, which use spatial metaphors, and the private sphere and what reconfiguration work is going on there. And we could think about stuff like the way that some smart city activity works as a way of an attempt to reclaim the whole agenda from the private sphere, or to bring, we see screens going in public spaces which use all this data. So there's something going on there, but I don't think we can quite capture it because it's such a heterogeneous phenomena. But yes, if you're looking for some kind of interesting big theoretical answer with the same sort of register as space-time compression, I'm not sure I can give you one because it's such a heterogeneous phenomenon. But yeah, there are big questions that I don't know the answer to about how perhaps. Okay, one sort of more practical, concrete thing. If we take the smart city in a broader sense, then clearly we're talking about things like the growth of Amazon and Uber, even dating apps, which in particular ways have massive, significant effects on the way people move around cities and the way that people relate to each other, and even the shape of our high streets and perhaps the nature of nightlife. So it's very open-ended and endless. But yeah, depending on our units of analysis, we could draw out a lot of spatial implications for cities. But it's just part of the picture. So
Thank you.
I'm rambling on and on. Please ask another question.
We have time for one last brief question and brief answer. There is it, right before the bell. We have right in the back.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm not a political geographer, and maybe simple question, maybe it's too ridiculous, I don't know. Could we think about smart cities linearly as a repression tool or liberation empowerment tool? Could you say something about it? Is it useful to think about smart cities in that way? And you were also mentioning algorithmic governance. Isn't this tool, let's call it tool, smart cities, contributing to development of algorithmic governance that is contributing to the algorithmic governance that is at the detriment of kind of human liberties all over the world, not only in China, but perhaps. I don't know. Okay, is it useful to think about it as a liberation empowerment tool on the one hand, and as a repression tool, on the other hand?
Yeah. Well, I've not seen much in the smart city today which is particularly liberating or emancipating. But that's perhaps because the term smart city itself hasn't really taken off that much in the public sphere. It's remained a tool, a label which is used by policymakers and the private sector and different interest groups. So if you're thinking more generally about digital technology, whether or not it's actually called the smart city, then clearly there is potential there. And yet there's a danger, I think, because it can potentially be a move away from things like deliberation and public decision making. And, so, I mean, a good example is a colleague of mine has been doing some work on, I don't know if you've heard of the Indian, what's the name? Where women can report where they feel unsafe at night in the city. What's its name? I always forget it. It's an app where if you're a woman in the city, or a man as well actually, you can, if you're feeling unsafe in a particular place, you can just rate it. Click, I'm feeling unsafe, on your app. All the data is collected and put into a central map. And therefore, if you want to leave your house this evening and go out somewhere, you can look at your map and plot a route which avoids the dangerous areas. Sorry? Yeah, I don't know what you mean, but it's continually updated in real time. And so, what are we to make of that? Is that potentially liberating for women? I mean, or for people generally, potentially, in one sort of immediate sense. And yet, perhaps it takes our attention away from what the authorities are doing or not doing, or whether the police are doing. Perhaps we're not tapping into anything structural there. We're just sort of accepting things as what they are and avoiding them. I think there are other critical points we could make about. Yeah.
A quick response, and then we will shift gears. Oh, yeah, sorry.
So I just wanted to, I think it's a great example to end with because it's so complicated. So this is, it factors into the discourse on predictive policing, where, we see this a lot in North American cities, where, we're using police data, specifically around crime reports, and in some cases, this kind of affective data about where people feel safe, to determine the location of police, and often to even determine other things as well, whether or not someone should be arrested, even in potentially impacting sentencing.
Yeah.
So the challenge with predictive policing is that it tends to, so just take the example of having this affective data of whether or not someone feels safe. Often we know that sometimes people are responding, their feelings of safety are determined by or predicted by implicit bias or racism. So you could be walking in a neighborhood with mostly black people and say, oh, well, I don't feel safe. So a white person could do that. So the question being here, that data is not neutral, and that here is an example of data that is both liberating and repressive at the same time. And I think that a lot of these technologies have that kind of binary tension associated with them, and that it is a responsibility, it would seem, to pay attention to those who are most vulnerable in these situations and the ways in which these kind of algorithmic decision-making processes are impacting the people who have traditionally and historically had no voice. And so in that sense, the liberation part of it may take a back seat.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll hand over.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your discussion. And let me thank again Robert Cowley for the interesting talk.